picked up on some of those examples of the sort of neo-colonialist project, the way that China's Belt and Road Initiative is working, whereby the company, which in this case also happens to be owned by the country, because it is of course a state that has a bit more influence, say in the private, so-called private or company sector than other states would have, essentially sends its own sort of workers off onto a territory. And part of those deals that China is making with African governments is that the workers working on these projects, building, and they're usually infrastructure projects, things like buildings and dams and bridges and roads and that sort of thing, don't fall under the law of the local African government. They fall under the law of the Chinese, if we want to call it once again, the sort of colonists. So they report to the company, they don't report to the country. That's part of the deal. So the country is getting great cheap infrastructure, but in exchange, they need to sort of just leave that sort of little encampment of workers alone. That's essentially the model. There's many different nuances, which probably won't get into right now, but that's how we're starting to see it now. However, in the South African context, we can also take this conversation in a different direction, once again, to what's happening with the very big, as I like to call them, new citadels that we're building. In many ways, as a futurist, I think that South Africa might be appointed towards the future of the rest of the world rather than a laggard in this space, which is something that South Africans don't often get their heads around. We seem to think that, we're always a few steps behind the rest of the world. But if you look at the trends that are progressing across places like America and parts of Europe, the more sort of, up and coming, aspirational, higher growth areas, or even look at what's going on in places like Dubai and across the Middle East, a lot of them seem to be adopting, for better or for worse, quite a lot of the South African models of organizing society. And unfortunately, that's quite an unequal way of organizing society because, as we all know, South Africans, we tend to live in gated compounds or in private citadels. We have an armed guard at the gate. We might have a few of our friends or frenemies inside that sort of gated compound with us. We'll have amenities inside that. And the trend is towards more amenities going behind private gates, essentially outside the scope of the law. So we've got massive examples here in Joburg. You've got, of course, the Waterfall City sort of state development that's got corporate and retail buildings as well as residential buildings, lots of amenities. You've got the Stain City compounds coming up. And these are essentially private cities. So although they're parts of the greater community, they don't necessarily operate by the same rules. And of course, just for context, we are living in 2021. We all know about COVID lockdowns and COVID restrictions. You can look at the difference of law in front of the gate and behind the gate, and how the law is not even really allowed to get onto private property without a warrant and all those sorts of things. And when you've got larger and larger proportions of society sort of operating behind gates, essentially becoming more and more self-sufficient, because our compound model here in South Africa started out just with a few streets, putting a boom up on the gate, and saying, okay, we're going to control access to our little community. From there, it went into building full sort of residential complexes and estates that might have entertainment there. So something like a golf course or a lake or, anything like that. Even some of the new farming compounds you can see now where you can go and be a part sharecropper in like a little wine farm in KwaZulu-Natal, of all places, for example. But from there, it's become more and more self-sufficient. So we're seeing these private citadels setting up schools, setting up shops, setting up even private CBD districts within inside them, meaning that the people that live in that space don't necessarily need to go out into wider city or outside of the city gates, the citadel gates. So from my perspective, it's almost like a micronation type model that we're seeing, we're tending towards. And as I said, this is something that South Africans have sort of become accustomed to. That sort of creep or that normalization of privatizing of everyday life is something that we've had to do out of both necessity and demand, because, of course, we don't necessarily have a government that's able to provide us with the same sort of service levels that someone in an upper middle class, say, income bracket would be able to get on a more sort of socialist or welfare type basis in another part of the world. So people have kind of done that for themselves. But it's also been done out of sort of a desire of separatism, because you can put this under the sort of the more disturbing trends of our age towards things like the rise of nationalism and towards sort of divisions in society, which is perhaps a slightly less comfortable conversation. But what we're seeing now is that other parts of the world are starting to adopt this model too. So if you look at the sort of those, like the Palm Islands, sort of, you know, the luxury estates up there in Dubai, you know, the man-made islands on the sea, it operates on a very similar sort of level. And they don't have the excuse of saying they have to do it to prevent crime, for example, which was the South African sort of excuse for building these cities. It's more being done just out of a desire for the sort of rich to live apart and to create some sort of status level apart from the rest of society. So there's that motive. And there's also the motive towards more autonomy, because as states become more powerful and our governments are tending bigger over time, particularly at the moment, people are looking at ways to sort of reinstate some of that autonomy over their lives. And one of the ways to do that is to get away into your sort of private setups. So in that case, private cities would be more sort of residential private cities and by choice rather than company private cities, which is once again quite a different model. You know, the one is controlled by a single entity, the other one is more controlled by almost a group of sort of anarchist citizens, you can put it that way, although I'm pretty sure people that live in Waterfall Estate or Dainfern wouldn't consider themselves anarchists, but in some ways it's quite a radical thing to say I'm going to live in society but not of it. So that's another way to sort of look at how these private city models are starting to play out in the South African context.